Right, stuff here at the bead shop, and I'm going to show you all that you need to know to create our latest kit, which is this lovely embroidered string of pearls plant. Just lent itself with all these long tendrils and the beads mimicking the strings of pearls of the plant. It just works really well. So I'm going to talk you through the different stitches you need to know and also how to set up. So I've got my piece of fabric ready. I would always recommend giving your fabric a bit of an iron before starting to set up. Sometimes these creases come out, but sometimes they don't, and it's much harder to iron it once you've got all your embroidery and beads on. So I'm just demonstrating with a embroidery hoop that I've got at home here. So the easiest way, if you put the outer part of the hoop, which is the bit with the screw fixture at the top, down first. Now your fabric will have your trace design on the back, and we're going to place that with the back up, facing upwards over there, and you can kind of see where your hoop is, so you can kind of centre your design there. And then the inner part of the hoop, which is slightly smaller, you press into that circle and you'll see it creates a nice taut fabric. Now the joy of this bit is it tightens up and loosens off, so it's probably easier to get the fabric in when it's loose, but if you were to continue working with it loose, you get a floppy fabric. So you can adjust that by pulling all the edges in and making sure it's nice and neat, and then when you think it's all good, you can tighten up that screw at the top, and that just holds your fabric really nice in place. Can tweak it and tighten it as much as you need, kind of aiming for this to be fairly taut, and you can tell by that sound you don't want it too bouncy but equally not too taut, so that's a good sort of tension there. And then that's everything prepared, ready to start stitching. So I'll show you on the original design. So this embroidery is built up in 3 layers. So we've got the plant pot, which you can see is done in sort of a lovely sort of deep reddy brown colour, and the outline, which is this bit here and this top bit round there and then down across the bottom, that's done in 1 stitch, which is back stitch. And then all the little details, so the lines on the pot, these little decorative bits, and the triangular design at the top here, that is done in running stitch. So I'm going to show you how to do all of those. And then the next stage is the actual tendrils. So they are done by a split stitch, and then the beads are attached individually using a sort of short running stitch. So I will show you how to do each one of those now. So I'm using a nice bright purple thread so you can see what I'm doing. So embroidery thread is nice and thick. It's actually made up of 6 individual little strands. So if I zoom in a bit now, most of the time you'll perhaps use all 6 pieces at once, but for the actual outline of the pot I've used just 3 pieces at once, and you can see how you can just gently pull them apart. Now if you try and pull straight, sometimes it works and sometimes it gets in a horrible pickle, so I tend to try and pull my 2 pieces apart like that and then run my hand along them, keeping sort of the tail, as it were, that we're splitting in my hands, so you don't end up with it all springing up in a mess. So I've now got a short piece. The reason I'm using short piece, you'd think, given that we're going to be doing quite a bit of stitching, you want a really long piece, but the longer your piece is, the more chance there is of it getting caught up and tangled, so you're much better off using short pieces at a time and then cutting more if you need to. Now one good trick about threading needles, so we've got embroidery needle here, and I'm just actually putting the needle on top of the thread and folding it in half, and then running my finger along there, and that creates a nice neat sort of fold in all the threads. So rather than having to struggle with getting the ends through, you can get all pieces through like that. You might have your own tricks, but I always find that works for me. And then just to stop our thread from coming through the fabric, we're going to tie a small overhand knot, and I tend to do that by wrapping it around my finger and then threading through. And then we want to be close to the end. And there we go. And that is a small enough knot so that it's not going to pull through our fabric here. So wherever you want to start, so you may have your design traced out on the back, so you've got a bit of a guide, but for this I'm just showing you how to do each stitch. So a back stitch is where you are going to form a solid line of stitches but in individual short pieces. So we're going to make one small stitch, that's probably about 4mm. I'm then going to come up from the back to the front where I want the next stitch to end. So you can see there, actually the light helps here, you can see where the stitch is at the back as well. So on the front we've just got that short piece there, and then come up where we want the next stitch to end. And the reason for doing that is so that we get a solid line, we're going to go back. So we're going to go down where the first stitch ends, and then we're going to come up where the next stitch is going to finish. So that'll be the third one. So you can see there, that's the first part. I've gone in where the first stitch ended, and I'm coming out where the third stitch will end. So that's going to create the second stitch. So you can see we've got 2 stitches there, and then you're just going to repeat that. So I'm going to go down where the previous stitch finished and up where we want the next stitch to end. And that's why it's called back stitch, because you're always starting from the back, so going back and then moving forwards. And you get into a nice little rhythm with that. If you find it hard, what I'm doing, I don't know if you can see that properly with the light, there we go. So what I'm doing to guide my needle, I'm actually just applying a little bit of pressure on the needle from the back. So that helps guide you up. Now if you're trying to follow a neat line, you can always go down as one step and then on the back see where your line is and go through as your next step. It still has a desired effect, and if you're trying to keep within a line, sometimes it's easier to see what you're doing. From going from the front and pushing up, you're kind of guessing that, but either will work. So say that's how much stitching we need to do. So that's a straight line, quite straightforward, and it's easy to kind of keep your stitches a similar sort of length. Now if you're wanting to turn a corner, so we'll need to do that on the edges of our plant pot here, that's much easier to do by doing shorter stitches. So if I'm going to turn a corner here, rather than making it the same length and quite angular, I would perhaps go half the length. Again, if you've got a line on the back, it's much easier to follow. But those shorter lines, shorter stitches, will create a much more subtle curve rather than it looking very angular. So little stitches just helps you control that detail. So there we go. So that is our back stitch. And I'm just going to use the same thread for this and show you how I would do a running stitch. So running stitch is very similar, except that we are going to be just creating short stitches and not going back on ourselves. So I tend to like to have my work facing me, so I will potentially work backwards and forwards, up and down. But the idea with running stitch is that you just create stitches, and rather than going backwards, we're just going to come up where we want the next stitch to be. So that might be a short gap between stitches. It might be that we want to create an effect where it's more of a decorative stitch and we're creating a pattern. So you're basically coming up where you want your stitch to start and going down where you want your stitch to finish. So it's quite straightforward, and you can see you just end up with like little short dashes. This is what I've done here on the sort of pot, just as a decorative feature, and also at the top here. So all of these stitches, so the initial zigzag shape I've done in backstitch, and then the short lines in the side, the triangles, are all done with long running stitch. So you don't have to keep your stitches short, you can have them as long as you like. So if we were then going to go up the, oh, I've caught my fabric in the back. That's something you do need to look out for. Quite easy to do, but if ever you go wrong, by far the easiest thing is, rather than trying to go back through the fabric, is just pull your needle off your thread and then pull the thread out of the way. That way you're going to preserve your thread, you're not going to make a mess or a large hole in the fabric, and then you can just re-thread your needle. It's bound to happen, and you might just accidentally catch a bit of another piece of thread, or your needle will come off. It's not the end of the world. These things happen when you're embroidering and sewing. So you might want to do longer stitches. The design I've put on the pot is really just a guide. Obviously you can follow that, it works quite well, but if you've got your basic plant pot shape done, you can then decorate it and fill it however you like. It's just worth bearing in mind that obviously a lot of it's going to get covered by the tendrils, and that's what's going to be the main focus. So you perhaps don't want to spend a lot of time doing a really intricate design on your pot and then find that actually you're covering almost all of it up. So there we go. So that are the first two stitches. So that's our back stitch and running stitch. Now's a good time, because my thread's got quite short, it's going to be quite awkward to show you the next bit. So I'm just going to show you how I fasten off the ends. Now, I'm never too precious about the back, it's all about the front really. That's the bit that's going to be on show. Equally, you don't want to create massive knots and bulky bits on the back, so I go for just a really simple, I'm going to thread my needle underneath the previous stitch there, pull it through, and what you end up creating is a loop there, and then following the loop round, I'm going to take the needle through the loop we've created, and that you'll see is creating a small knot. And then if you slowly and gently pull that down, so you don't want to be tugging, but equally don't want it too loose. So I'm just helping with my finger to slide that down. Now that means that this stitch is now nice and tight, but equally it's not pulled that previous stitch that we've knotted around out of tension either, so that's why we don't want to pull too hard, but that's not going to come undone. And sometimes I just slip my needle under another stitch just to keep that thread out of the way, and then trim off. It's a nice simple way of just keeping your ends neat. Sometimes when you're threading through to the front of the fabric, you'll catch your little tail ends in and they'll pull through to the front. If that happens, if you take the back of your needle and just hook them out of the way again, that'll keep it neat on the front. So the next stitch we're going to do is what's called a split stitch, and for this I'm going to use a piece of embroidery thread that's using all 6 strands at once. So same again, small knot in the end. If you prefer to do that with a needle, that's fine. I could just get into the habit of doing it sometimes with my fingers. And then, because the eye is a little small, sometimes when you fold over you can't get all the strands through. So this is where I would make sure, sometimes just lick my fingers, run that through, and then just trim the end off with sharp scissors so you've got a nice straight bit. And then same process, thread through. Now I always find that if I try and push the eye of the needle over the thread rather than the thread through the needle, I find that I always have much more success threading my needles that way. So we're going to start in the same way and thread through from the back to the front. And this is a stitch, the split stitch is where we're going to be using it for the tendrils of our plant. So you'll see that it creates a much thicker effect, and it's got a little bit of texture to it as well. So this is slightly similar to a back stitch in that we're going to be working backwards. So we first of all make a small stitch, which is the same as both the back and running stitch, and then we're going to come up but halfway through the stitch we've already made. Can you see that there? I'm coming up right in the middle of that stitch. We're splitting it essentially, which is where the stitch gets its name. And then we're going to make another stitch on top. So there you can see close up, I've got a little split and it's spread that stitch, and then the next stitch is coming out of it, and I'm going to do the same again. So the new stitch we've just made, we're going to get our needle up through, pull that through, and then make a new stitch. So you can see it's creating a much thicker effect of the previous stitches, and that nice little split in the stitches gives it a really sort of full texture as well. Now sometimes when you're coming up through, it's slightly guesswork, but if you find that when you come up and split and you've only caught a tiny bit of thread on one side, it's worth just repositioning your needle and coming up so you've got roughly half on each side. I wouldn't worry if you've got 4 and 2, as long as it looks right and it looks okay for you, then that's the important bit. And you just keep going. And the same thing as we did with the back stitch, turning a corner there, with our tendrils we're going to want to make some of them wavy and change direction if we want to, and this bit's kind of really up to you, but they've all got slight sort of organic shapes to them. So in order to do that, again, hold your work how you want to. I always find I need to be looking at my design, so in theory our tendrils will be going down, so I'll be looking at it going downwards. I'm just going to turn this so that I can demonstrate the moving around. So I'm splitting that stitch and then I'm going to make a slight curve. So all I'm doing, I'm not making it a dramatic change, but just ever so slightly, so I'm putting my needle in slightly to the right of the previous stitch. And the other thing I'm doing is on the back I'm just holding down the thread with my left hand while I'm stitching through on the right, just so as I try and push through I'm not loosening that thread, so that's not going to move. It just helps keep it nice and neat. So I'm going to come up through that stitch, and then again the following stitch I'm going to move ever so slightly to the right again, and then come up in the middle, and again slightly again. So depending on how far over you get, depends on how much of a curve you've got. If you find that you want to pull the stitch over, what you can do is come up slightly over and then go through the stitch so that you're actually pulling the stitch in a direction as well. So you can help direction in 2 ways there. So now I'm coming back round in another direction. Again, if you're doing straighter bits, you can go for long stitches. So you can probably get away with sort of 5mm to 7mm here. And then if you're doing shorter changing of directions, I would go for sort of 4 to 5mm. Just have a lot more control over the finer details than with shorter stitches. And once you get going, it's very, very therapeutic, and it's quite fun to see everything evolving. So it's always up through the middle and then down. And when you come to the end of a tendril, you want to stop your back stitch at split stitch. You would just, on your very last stitch, I've come up through the middle of my stitch, and then I would just go down where I want to finish. Now I often make this last stitch a bit shorter, so rather than being about this far away from the last stitch, I'm going in just a few millimetres afterwards, and that produces just a nice pointed end to the end of the row of stitches. And again, you would just fasten that off, trying not to create a too bulky a knot. And then snip that off. Now you'll see, as I've been holding my work, it's got a little bit looser, so you can always pull that tight, and it might be that your screw at the top has just come a bit loose, so you can tighten that up as well. So that covers the basic stitches that we're going to be using, but what I'm also going to do is just show you how to attach a few beads. Right, so for this we just need a couple of small beads. These are 4mm beads, which are a similar size to the larger ones in the kit. And then we also need a slightly different thread and needle. So this is beading thread. Looks a lot like just normal sewing thread, but it's actually incredibly strong and you can't snap that. So it's a great way of ensuring your beads are going to stay in place. And we're using a slightly different needle. So this is quite a fine needle, but with a long, thin eye. And the reason for that is that we need our needle to pass through the hole in the beads. So a normal sewing needle often gets stuck on the eye. So again, we need to put a knot in the end of the thread. I tend to go around twice with this because it's fine, we don't want it to pull through the fabric. And then our beads will be getting put onto the tendril bits, so I'm just going to start here. Now, string of pearls, the beady bits on the plant tend to stick out on the sides, so that's how I've positioned them on the embroidery too. I'm coming up where I want to start, and that's a good, kind of like a few millimetres away from the stitching there. I'm scooping up my bead on my needle, and then you want to basically go down the other side almost exactly the width of the bead there. So you can measure it, which I've just held it up, and then by eye I've just gone down there. The reason for that, and you'll see nicely here, is the thread goes straight up out of the fabric through the bead and then straight down. If you leave too much of a gap before going down, what you'll end up with is your bead moving around and also exposed bits of thread. So that's a good way to keep an eye on that. So you don't want to go too wide. So pick up another bead and then go down. Now if you find that when you've added a bead there is too much excess thread, you can easily take your needle off, pull your bead out and then reposition your thread. It's not difficult to do, and basically you just keep going along your tendril and coming up where you want your next bead to be, picking up your bead and then going down the other side to secure. And there we go, all of a sudden it's looking quite plant-like. So it's really straightforward, this process, but it does really bring it to life as well. And then when you come to fastening off your thread, you do the same as we've done before. You can hook it under the closest thread, so that might be one of the embroidery thread bits on the back, and then loop it through again. And I always try and hook under another bit of thread before trimming off. It just makes it a little bit more secure and keeps the threads out of the way. And there we have it. With the actual design here, I've gone for a mixture of sizes. So we have got 4mm pearls, we've got 3mm pearls, and then we've also got a few small seed beads on the bottom there as well. Now some of the strands I've gone for 4, 3 and smaller tiny beads at the bottom. Some of them I've mixed it up a little bit, but you'll find that where you've put your tendrils sometimes will dictate a little bit on where you want your beads. So I've gone for like a nice even spread of beads, so I wouldn't necessarily want to put the same amount of beads evenly spread on every single tendril, because then it'll just look a little bit too ordered and not organic, as plants tend to be. So you'll just play around with this, and if you end up finishing it and really not liking a bead placement, or that your tendrils are too short or too long, it's still not the end of the world. You can adjust them. One of these tendrils, I can't remember which one it was now, it might have been this one down here, I thought it ended too short, so I actually just went back and added in a little bit and added a few more beads. So you can still finesse your design right up until the end. But there we go. So that's covered everything you need to know to actually create your design. There are templates in the kit, so if you're unsure where to start, you can follow these designs, and then often you'll end up developing them and adapting them anyway. But yeah, there's no wrong or right way really. I hope you have fun creating your string of pearls plant.